I'll be talking about typefaces for everyone. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction about where I come from, really. I'm the founder of Maag, a studio for typeface design based here in London. We've been going for just about 30 years. And starting off by myself, 30 years ago, we have grown to a business that is now supporting about 50 people. We speak about 14 different languages, or from 24 different nationalities, so a really multicultural place. And we design, obviously, mostly custom fonts. We've got some of our own typefaces on our font library as well, but primarily our main business model is custom typefaces. And these are some of the clients we've been working for in the past. And obviously one of them is for the BBC Reith, of which David will be talking more about when I'm finished here. I've got a lot of slides, so I'm going to get through them, fairly swiftly. I'm also, as the intro slide also said, I'm a co-director and co-founder of the Readability Group, and our main product and service is a font surveyor. And I will be talking a little bit more, just for a couple of minutes, what that all means. But basically, we've built a testing platform that lets you test your typefaces and how well they will perform across a range of accessibility barriers. Down here, you have a link as well where you can actually watch a presentation that David, Gareth Ford-Williams and I gave on the first survey that we did. Now, onto our, hang on, is it not working here? Onto our presentation, the tank. This is a M113 personal carrier tank. The reason I'm showing that is actually is a not very well-known fact, is that besides being a trained typesetter and typographer, I'm also a trained tank driver, specifically this particular tank, the M113. And the reason I'm showing this here as well is that has to do with accessibility. First of all, it's great fun to drive a tank. I can highly recommend it to everyone, and there is no barriers when you're in a tank. There is nothing that stops you. You either go simply through it or over it, But more importantly, this is the inside of a tank, particularly the driver cabin here. And you will see that there's only a handful of dials there, particularly a couple sticks, that V-shape kind of like thing, which is basically the steering for the tank. The user interface of the driver cabin in a tank is so simple that you need about 5 minutes instruction and you will be able to drive away. Now, whether you will not cause damage or not whilst driving, that's a different matter altogether. But it is absolutely fantastic and simple user interface design and user experience. It does exactly what it says on the tin. There is no ifs, no buts. It's that simple. And this is really what all kind of user interfaces should look like. Do exactly what it does. What's important, though, is that it meets emotional, functional, and technical accessibility criteria. And the Readability Group, we really kind of like work by those three principles. Is it emotionally, functionally, and technically accessible? And what, is it appealing? Was it built correctly? Does it work? And I want to go a little bit more into detail now. I want to start off with the emotional accessibility, and the tank certainly delivered on that, considering that it is great fun and you actually want to do it. In the context of type, as Chris has already alluded to, many companies, are starting to look into, or have started to look into, having typefaces and are more conscientious about choosing their own typefaces, as was the BBC. And these are a couple examples, that probably are fairly well known. Intel and Lush we have designed at Dalton Maag. Horse Ferry and Chadwick was designed by Neville Brody for Channel 4, and the Nickelodeon, I don't know who did that, but you can really see how they emotionally engage, with the users or with the audience, but also how they represent actually the brand. So the letter shapes themselves give you already an indication of what that brand is. So really, kind of like how do we understand, our emotions? Those are the 6 basic emotions that psychologists and psychiatrists have pretty much agreed on, that every human, irrespective of cultural background or upbringing, etc., has. Their fear, anger, disgust, sadness, surprise, and happiness. The strongest of which is fear. And those basic emotions, they let us survive. They help us survive. Remember that humans have been around, or Homo sapiens has been around for about 100,000 years, and it's thanks to the emotions that we are actually successful as a species. And every human, irrespective of cultural background, reacts to some basic shapes exactly the same. We all react to round shapes as warm, friendly, soft, inviting, whereas sharp shapes, angular shapes, we perceive as dangerous, as hurtful, as negative. So in this instance of the blackberries, here, understanding the perception of shapes allows you to make an informed decision whether it's actually worth sticking your hands into the thorns to grab a few blackberries, whether it's worth the pain, whether the satisfaction of having a juicy, sweet blackberry, whether it's worth that pain. It's purely based on shapes, whether you know what a blackberry tastes like or not. And so do typefaces. The shapes of typefaces can elicit emotions as well. And of course, when we start talking about typefaces, there is a degree of cultural bias involved as well. When we look at the black letter typeface, that is used for the word fear, we have obviously the cultural connotations that come with the baggage, of the mid-20th century. Some of us will obviously experience anger when we see Comic Sans, and I personally, I experience great sadness, when people use Helvetica, which is a 2-hour conversation in itself. But also playing with typefaces, can also help you as a designer play with the emotions, conversely, with the emotions of your audience. So you need to start thinking about the choices of your typefaces and who is your audience, who are you talking to, and what are the cultural backgrounds, of those audiences. I just want to go through a few samples very quickly of like different typefaces and type styles, what they really mean, or how generally in a Western world, how we perceive them, And I'm going to go through this list fairly quickly without really saying much. But you will get the gist of what we're trying to say here. And that brings me really, again, looping back into brand. Obviously Chanel, the basic logo and the basic communication typeface is a sans serif, very plain, almost factual, but also quite stylish, because of its minimalist appearance and its reduction. But when you look, when you look at I Love Coco, really they got it wrong. It says I love cow. And once you've seen I love cow, you can never unsee it again, ever. So I think there is a slight accessibility fail there. which brings me to the functional bit. Was it built correctly? And a few years ago, we designed the typefaces for Nokia Pure, and one of the tasks we had to do was design an Arabic. So the first design we did was the one that you see, the Arabic, the top line Arabic, so a Kufic style, very geometric, very angular, and the Arabs loved it, and it worked on the user interfaces within the mobile phones. It was brilliant. Everyone was happy. And then the Persians got their hands on it, and the Persians flat out refused to read it. They said, we can read it, but we will not, because it is Arab imperialism. So we had to go away and actually design a different style, a different calligraphic style of Arabic, to find a compromise that the Arabs, the ethnic group of the Arabs, the Persians, and the Central Asians, by which I mean Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc., that they were all reasonably happy with. This was a style they could all agree with, that felt neutral to them, that didn't favor one kind of like group over another. But this was a learning that when you start going into other writing systems, you really have to do your homework. That's when it gets tricky. When we talk about functional accessibility, we always need to keep the user in mind, the audience in mind. And as we get older, our eyesight deteriorates. So when you look at this, and you see the blurred out part of the type, you will see that kind of like the typeface on the left, which is actually Reith Sans, performs much better in terms of kind of like recognizing shapes than the typeface on the right, which is a grotesque typeface called Active Grotesque. So it's much more accessible. That brings me to actually, I want to quickly talk a little about how we actually read. The first thing is we don't read in a continuous line, but we read in saccades. So a saccade is basically a jump from one fixation to another. A fixation is basically when your eyes fixate on a particular point in the line and then pick up 7 to 9 characters in that fixation, and then jump 7 to 9 characters to the next fixation. What you want to achieve with the choice of your typeface and typesetting, that this movement is continuous rather than you having to loop back. The more you have to loop back, the more your reading process is interrupted, the more the reading speed slows down, the more the comprehension suffers. So you really want to have that even movement, and you ideally want to have 7 to 9 characters in a saccade. Now we're talking, of course, about continuous text here rather than display environments. The 7 to 9 characters in a saccade actually also at a reader distance of about 30 centimeters and type size between 9 and 11 point, whatever that may convert to in pixels, actually the 7 to 9 characters fit exactly into your fovea, the center of the back of your eye, the center of the retina. The fovea holds about 500,000 of rods and cones, basically the receptors, so super high resolution. Of course, as we age, you will start losing some of that resolution, and therefore you have to understand that fine details you probably can't see anymore. Once that's been picked up by the retina, so that's that one saccade, once it's been picked up, it's being sent through the optic nerve back into the back of your brain, into the occipital lobe where the visual cortex rests. The image gets distributed across the brain for particular processing purposes, but everything that you read gets sent into the visual word form area, the red dot. That sits just about behind the top of your ear, usually in the vast majority of people in the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is primarily responsible for linguistic functions, whereas your right hemisphere is primarily responsible for arithmetic functions. In about 15% of the world's population, this is reversed, but the functionality is exactly the same. So for the purpose of this presentation, let's talk about the left hemisphere. So in the visual word form area, every single character gets decoded and then character pairs and word shapes are being put together. The word shape is then being sent into the lexical area to try determining the meaning of the word shape. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and the shape is being sent into the blue area, the phonological area, where a sound unit is attached to individual letters and the entire shape. And together with visual shape and sound shape, the lexical area can successfully decode the meaning of what you are reading. And this process is very important because it explains dyslexia, which is another 20 to 25-minute lecture for which unfortunately today we haven't got time. But in short, in one sentence, dyslexia has very little to do with reading and very much to do with sound. And we can maybe come back to that in our Q&A. Also, when we read into saccades, we have to understand the line lengths. Research has shown that optimum line length is 7 to 8 saccades. Anything more or less than that will have a dramatic impact on reading speed and comprehension. Now, as typographers, we have known for hundreds of years that your optimal line length is 55 to 65 characters. Now we're backing this up with science, because if you multiply 7 to 9 characters with 7 to 8 saccades per line, you get 55 to 65 characters. Boom, science is brilliant, you know. So we can actually rationalize design decisions, you know, with human science. But when you design a typeface, or when you create your typography, you also need to again think about the choice of your typeface. So what we've seen before, I'm just quickly going back. This is BBC Reith serif. You can see it's fairly even. It has very little contrast, and I'm replacing it with a Bodoni style typeface, so very high contrast. This is really bad for reading because it creates vertical striping, you know, and vertical striping can cause an epileptic seizure in about one in 10,000 readers. You know, it's called reading epilepsy. There is actually such a thing. So for continuous reading, avoid high contrast in your typeface, but also avoid high contrast in fore and background colors, because again, this creates a stroboscopic effect. Always reduce your fore and background contrast fractionally, like you would do in traditional book typography. I need to really get on here. Contrast is also an important thing in terms of user behavior and sustainability. Many users will, on mobile devices, reduce the brightness of their screen to save battery life, but also, you know, because it doesn't glare on your eyes so much. And this has an impact on your type in that you absolutely must make sure that your typeface is strong enough to hold up against a darkened background, against a darkened screen. You know, sustainability is an important part as well. We designed in 2005 the typefaces for the BT phone directory, the printed directory, and just by changing the typeface, BT managed to save approximately 10 lines per page. Now you multiply that over, say, kind of like, you know, 300 pages a book, you know, and 50 million books printed a year, you can absolutely see the impact that has on the environment by saving paper, by saving ink, by saving time. It actually took the BT approximately 2 print runs to save the investment in the type, you know. And again, we're coming back to functional accessibility. Does it say what it says on the tin? Here, this particular example, if you look at the line where the red arrow shows, excuse me, if they have to tell you that you might have to consider, or you might have to mind your O and 0 and your 1 and L or I, you know, then clearly they have already failed in their accessibility. And what's even more enraging is they're making it your responsibility rather than their own, you know, for you being able to successfully log into your swap testy thingy, you know. brings me to the last part, and I'll take another 5 minutes or so tops, the technical bit. First of all, technically accessible, does it behave on screens? Coming back to the example of a high resolution, high contrast typeface, the bottom line shows you actually how that will behave at a low resolution or at smaller availability of pixels. As opposed to the left where we have BBC, Reef, Serif, where you have low contrast, relatively even strokes, which then display much better on the screen. This has an impact on the legibility, on the readability on the screen. So you need to think about that. Is the typeface actually suitable? Has it been engineered in such a way that it is suitable for the screen? Do you have linguistic coverage? This is a typeface family we designed for Facebook for their camera product, where we had multilingual kind of like support, across a number of different type styles. So if you are a corporate entity, you need to be able to communicate across the globe in native languages. And is a good type and good accessibility is actually good for your finances. In the UK, the accessibility market is worth about £15 billion. That's generally disability, generally. And when you start talking about how many people are functionally illiterate, or even fully illiterate, by actually lowering the barriers for reading, you can really, really support some people accessing vital services. And this brings me very briefly to the font surveyor, which we created. And we created characteristics for these 4 things. Characteristics for typefaces are, of course, the features of a typeface. What are the proportions? What are the individual bits? So that's what we're looking at when we're testing typefaces. We're looking at user characteristics. What does that exactly mean? For example, here we have in the survey we had different types of poor near vision characteristics or different types of dyslexic traits. These were the results, and one of the things you can see instantly is that all the dyslexia fonts performed really poor, and even Comic Sans performed really poorly. Now if you're a fan of Helvetica, you will have to see that it didn't do very well at all. Well, it just about scraped through, I'd say. Whereas Calibri is pretty good. And surprisingly, San Francisco Pro, the Apple font, and Seago from Microsoft, and Verdana and BBC Reef Sans, they were really scoring quite well across the board, even for people with dyslexic traits. And strangely enough, people with dyslexic traits, the dyslexia fonts still didn't perform well, certainly not as well as the ones that you would have as system fonts that were there, and Helvetica didn't perform at all. And the same for people with poor near vision. But let's have a very, very quick look as to what that actually means in terms of type and why that could be. These are the 4 top performers. They're obviously grotesques and humanist typefaces. I won't go into the detail what makes a grotesque and a humanist. But when we compare, for example, San Francisco Pro with Helvetica, we have to ask ourselves, why is it? Because proportions are pretty much the same. The basic design features are exactly the same. But what we're finding is that the letter spacing is very different. San Francisco Pro is quite generous and quite relaxed, whereas Helvetica is really super tight, and that's where the problem is, probably. Why is Ubuntu, for example, not performing as well as the other 2 humanist typefaces or San Francisco? Probably the font weight, because it's just a little bit heavier than all the others. And then obviously we have seen that the dyslexia fonts didn't do well, despite having like the basic proportions and shapings as the good performers. But it's probably too much. They're too much in your face, and it's really disturbing. And I would also suggest that actually serif typefaces can absolutely be used, and they perform well, as we have seen with BBC Reef serif. But Times New Roman didn't perform well, and Roboto Slav was just about you know, and again, the reason is most likely for Roboto that the letter spacing is too tight, and for Times New Roman, the contrast way too high and tight letter spacing. So when you choose typefaces and when you work with typefaces, always think of the 3 pillars of accessibility. And with that, I'm going to hand over now to David, and I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno. That was fantastic. I can see there are some questions, but like I said, we are going to hold them to the end. I think it was a fascinating talk, and it can't be an accident that the highest scoring fonts were by Apple, Microsoft, and BBC. And I think that's an appropriate time to introduce our next speaker, David Bailey. If you would like to share your screen, David, and kick us off.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Bruno. Hi, everybody. Let me do the do. Okay, so as you heard from Bruno, I mean, my relationship with Bruno and with Gareth, the other person in the mix, when we created BBC Reith, it really forged our friendship, and kind of we came together around this Readability Group program of research to sort of like look into our mutual fascination with font design, but also what makes a typeface truly readable. But I'm going to tell you the story of BBC Reith, why and how we made it. We'll examine its design and how it benefits everyone, our users and the BBC itself. So I work at the BBC, an organisation that next year will celebrate its centenary. For 100 years, the BBC has informed, educated and entertained. It is a much admired British public service and global brand that continually strives for excellence and the cultural betterment of society, I suppose. I joined the BBC as Creative Director of User Experience Design in 2013, having spent a successful 16 years prior working in the more traditional world of graphic design, art direction and branding. I joined as Creative Director for the Global Experience Language, or GEL as it gets acronymed down to, is what it's known as. My remit really was to help develop this design framework, build greater understanding, ownership and use of it amongst colleagues, and raise its profile in the wider industry. GEL is much like any other digital design system. It's a set of interconnected patterns and shared practices, coherently organized, that we use to design our digital products, like these. So we've got BBC News, Sport, Weather, iPlayer, Sounds, and our children's products. These many services are used and loved by millions of people every day across the UK. I'll explain how our department, BBC UX&D, is structured, if I may, quickly. There are 6, here you see just 6 of our services. Okay, each of these product teams employ their own technical, editorial and business personnel, if you like, right? But they don't employ designers. We do that. We are a centrally sort of situated design team. We're approximately about 220 members, made up of UX designers, researchers, accessibility specialists, UX architects and UX writers. We assemble and embed these design teams and specialisms into each of those products to fulfill their design requirements. And each year or so, we rotate them into a different product to it provides them with new professional challenges and opportunities, but simultaneously ensures that they don't get too consumed by any specific product culture, which can happen. You can imagine a young designer will go and work in BBC News. After a year, they come out and they're all very serious about what they do and they need to get things done now. And then a year later, the same person will come out working in the children's products and they wear colorful t-shirts and everything's great, guys. It's that kind of culture that gets into all the people that work in those teams. And so by keeping our designers on a more horizontal frame of mind, it allows them to think of the big picture. And that big picture is providing a consistent BBC experience across all of these services through good user experience design. We publish our work, our guidelines, our articles and short films on the BBC website. If you go to bbc.co.uk/gel, you can find a great resource, which I'm sure many of you already have if you're interested in UX design. But if you haven't, please do. Gel was introduced in 2008, not long after the launch of the iPhone. Now, this device was hugely successful and spawned many other devices similar to it, and caused an exponential rise in the consumption of written articles on small screens. So whilst motion design and pinch zoom interaction and responsive web pages brought great accessibility benefits, the performance of the typefaces being used at smaller sizes on brightly backlit screens were being pushed to new limits. We were beginning to receive complaints about our reading experience and choice of typeface. So what were those typefaces? So when I arrived, we had these two typefaces. These were the two fonts that we used predominantly across the BBC experience. Gill Sans on the left there, which is a humanist style, so it has a very elegant style to it, fluctuating line widths, etc. That was used as our corporate identity typeface. And then we had Helvetica for the reading experience. Helvetica, which is a grotesque style, i.e. it's very equal proportioned, it delivers information without any kind of fanfare or flair. It's pure information, and it's quite severely kind of put together. So this gave us a mixed economy of different type styles, which gave a bit of brand confusion, essentially. And both of these typefaces were designed, you know, almost 100 years ago for the printed page, and so therefore don't perform well on today's high definition digital screens at different point sizes. So their legibility at smaller point sizes rapidly decreases, and you start to get this problem where words are misread. Now, sorry, I've gone forward a bit too far, yeah. So words are easily misread, especially in long form articles where the density of copy is increased. So here I saw this need to, an issue, a problem that we needed to fix, as well as an opportunity to introduce a more distinctive typeface system into our design framework. And we weren't the first to do this. I mean, there were many organizations, peer organizations of ours around us that had been already successfully implementing their own font styles. So this was strengthening both their reading experience and their brand. And then there was the cost-saving opportunity. So, you know, by investing, because we're a publicly funded service, right? So we're always looking to save money and spend it in the right way possible. By investing in and implementing our own typeface family, we will be able to retire many of our many third-party font licenses that we were paying each year, bringing a significant return on investment and freeing up money that could be better used elsewhere, frankly. So this proved to be a solid business case, and for a while I sort of shopped this around many of my colleagues, with the help of colleagues. It wasn't just me, obviously, but I guess I was spearheading this piece of work. And we pulled together this one-pager, essentially, that went up to the highest echelons of the BBC executive board, you know, saying that the font that we would commission would need to be more legible, more visually distinctive, and would need to save money. And it came back with the green light. You know, I even got asked why we weren't doing this already, and that was a question that I'd asked when I arrived at the BBC. I couldn't work out why it hadn't been done before, but there are a lot of reasons for that, but I won't go into them now. So we put out the call to a number of British typeface design studios, many of whom provided great responses, but it was Dalton Maag who really instilled the most confidence in our stakeholders. They are experts at what they do. They understood that the challenge that we faced. They understood the BBC and its remit, and they had this incredible track record of delivering highly performant typefaces for many large organizations. And then there is Bruno. Now, Bruno is such a passionate communicator that I knew that if we had a great ally like him when explaining the merits, it would really help when explaining the merits of introducing our own typeface, to the many BBC stakeholders. So we in the BBC assembled an influential steering group made up of senior leaders, designers, engineers, and accessibility and research specialists. And off we went to Dalton Maag Studios in South London to begin our education, which is, I guess, what you guys have been going through with Bruno's talk just now. We learned about type design, its history, importance, not just the aesthetics, but how our brains load and process character shapes in the written word. We took part in a number of workshops. In this example, we were asked to assign different font styles to different emotions. And these sessions really helped us understand our instinctive typeface associations and how they fit with the BBC, its legacy, its audiences, young and old. So Dalton Maag, armed with the learnings from these sessions, went away and began work. And simultaneously, I went away and started the long path of wearing out the shoe leather, moving around the BBC, engaging all the numerous stakeholders from the different products and services across TV, broadcast, radio, you name it. Explain the benefits of introducing our own typeface, introducing them to Bruno and his team, who educated in the same way that they had us. And armed with their new knowledge about typefaces and fonts, they then became powerful group of ambassadors for this project who helped spread the word and belief in what we were doing, which was a kind of canny move, really. So Dalton Maag came back to us with 7 concepts initially, and at first glance you may agree the difference in the design feels negligible. But what's great about Dalton Maag is they really are masters of what they do, and they're great at dissecting and describing the subtleties of individual character shapes and designs, and why each has a different character style or a different way of being read or being processed. And from this, our steering group were able to confidently whittle the 7 concepts down to 2. One humanist design and one grotesque. The grotesque is the one on the left there, option 4. And given the trend towards grotesque typefaces that we see today being used by many of the big media and tech companies, we expected that the grotesque font, once put into testing, would rise to the top. But after further development, technical testing on our platforms and user feedback on aesthetics and reading performance, it was the humanist style that prevailed. Its emotional and functional and technical accessibility were evident. And so in spring of 2018, we took delivery of our new typeface, BBC Reith, named after the original Director General of the BBC, Lord John Charles Reith. And we were delighted with it and still are. I mean, we developed both the sans and the serif style, and they're beautiful. A versatile font family comprising 5 weights, giving us 22 typographic tones of voice essentially to work with. We started with the Latin and the Cyrillic character sets, language sets, and subsequently built the Latin extensions for languages such as Igbo, Yoruba, Uzbek, and Pidgin, etc. So this allowed us to support 120 languages from day one across our world service. So we've since actually added the Arabic style, which we call BBC Reith Kalam. But I'm not going to go into that today. We're going to focus more on the Latin for now. So let's take a closer look at BBC Reith. It's a contemporary humanist face with consistent vertical terminals, sharp connections. There's definite echoes of Gil Sans here, but yet it's combined with a very functional and modern build, a stylish workhorse, if you like. The differences between Reith and our previous reading experience font Helvetica are numerous and significant. Reith has open letter shapes, allowing more air in, if you like, so to speak, which this aids readability, has a much more open feel to it, which is much more comfortable. It also has looser letter spacing, which again reduces strain on our eyes and brains as they saccadically read and process lines of type. And BBC Reith's lowercase ascenders rise higher than its uppercase characters, and this helps disambiguate these characters when they're placed alongside one another. So here in this example, you see the uppercase I alongside the lowercase L in the word illustration. With Helvetica, they're identical, whilst Reith's L, height and curled stem help us decode the letters quickly and successfully. And this another example of good disambiguation is with the lowercase b, d, p, and q. You can see that Reith's D and P have the traditional spur detail, but the B and Q do not. These characters are often misread by people with poor vision, learning disabilities, or conditions such as dyslexia because they look the same, essentially. So by addressing this, we're helping fix the problem and build in extra little design details that carry very subtle bits of charm. And now now really we have this range of typographic expression that we just didn't have before, and our designers are obviously thrilled with this. They can really sort of put our presentation to work in many more different ways than we had before. Prior to this, we had Helvetica light, bold or regular. I mean, that was it. And now we have this range of expression to communicate headlines and all sorts of different media and communication to our audiences, which is very exciting. BBC Sports was the first customer for BBC Reith. They introduced it into their product just using the sans style across all of the touch points. And we got a very positive response from day one. Of course, there were people that complained about the change. Some people are very unsettled by change. I understand that. But actually, we received very few complaints about it. And instantly, you can see this kind of, we saw this real injection of a modern visual aesthetic happening within the BBC that was also very functional. And then over the course of the next year or two, we've seen BBC Reith be implemented across all of our services, and news obviously taking it on across most of its touch points is just wonderful, seeing the range of expression and how it can communicate different types of news stories. And so I'm almost there now. That's it. The typeface itself is, any typeface is a fundamental element of any branding system. And BBC Reith and its success is now informing and will underpin the next iteration of the BBC's visual identity. So watch this space. And that's it. If you want to go and have a look at, learn more about this stuff, there's loads of it on BBC's, on our GEL website. So do please go and take a look. There's actually a film that we made about it called Introducing Reith. So enjoy that. And I think that is it. I need to escape this and then we're back in the room. And that's me.
Thank you so much, David. That was brilliant. And I do wish we were all back in an in-person event and then we could all give you a proper round of applause. Unfortunately, it will have to be a virtual round of applause. But thank you, Bruno. Thank you, David, for two really fascinating, really in-depth talks. We do have some questions, so we're going to take a look at those now. Bruno, I think the first one is for you, and it's from Suki. How did you validate regional preferences for the Nokia typeface in the Middle East? And can you give a kind of an overview of the research methods and type of questions you asked?
Well, it's kind of like less of like a methodology. It's basically we handed the font over to the client at the time, and then the client, in this case Nokia, they kind of like tested the fonts with different types of user groups or with the different markets, and then garnered the feedback. But nowadays, when we design typefaces for the Middle East, obviously taking the learnings from the Nokia project, we already know what to avoid and what directions to go to. We do tend to work with kind of like often 2 or 3 different consultants, and this is not only for Middle Eastern typefaces, but this can also go like the whole Indian subcontinent or Southeast Asia. We tend to work with different consultants, sometimes even linguists, to make sure that the shaping of the typeface is correct, and native speaking designers to make sure that we're not sort of like shooting way past like cultural preferences and cultural expectations as well. So that's really how we go about it. And usually in the design process is we start off with the conceptual phase, go to the consultants who will then give us feedback, and then develop the typeface. And toward the end of the development process, then go back, to get the micro typographic input and feedback as well. And by and large, this is a process that works pretty well.
David, if I may, could I ask about how the BBC approach it? Because obviously we see the BBC from a very UK-centric perspective, but obviously the BBC is worldwide and it's available across the world. So have you taken into account any regional variations, or did you take into account any regional variations with the Reith font?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, the Latin, the Cyrillic and the Arabic and the Latin extensions cover so many languages. When we did the testing, I believe that we assembled like a really great cross-section of different users, different cultural backgrounds, in different countries actually as well, I believe, to take part in the testing. The methodologies that they use vary depending on the different styles and the different situations, but I don't have that detail to hand because I wasn't directly involved in the testing of BBC Reith. We had a whole UX research team that took care of that. But the results were very, very rewarding and confirmed all of the good stuff that we expected to see. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give a great deal more detail on that because you'd have to ask some of our research team on that.
No, thanks, David. Appreciate that. I'm going to pick a question from Richard because it was something I was very keen to ask. Also, just like to point out, if anyone would like to ask a question in person, if you want to raise your hand in the participant panel, I'm more than happy to unmute you after this question. But Richard asks a really interesting question about how you test and measure readability. So what kind of metrics do you use? And is it something that can be easily factored into, I say, a standard design process or a regular design process?
Yes. I mean, there's two ways to test. There's the quantitative testing, which is what we did with the font surveyor, and then there's qualitative testing, which actually the neuroscience world has been doing for the last 15 to 20 years. And and with the qualitative testing, you can actually get, you can actually measure legibility and readability quite objectively, because you can use eye tracking. So say for readability, which is really the smoothness by which you can read a passage of text. So for readability, with the eye tracking, basically measures your saccades and whether your saccades are smooth or whether you jump back and forth. And then you can do the comprehension testing, that after each paragraph, you can ask the participant a set of questions and that pertain to the passage of text that they have actually read. And if they answer correctly within an expected parameter, then they have actually comprehended the text. So that gives you an indication about the readability when you want to test the legibility, which is actually how easily can you, how quickly and how accurately can you identify an individual character. Again, you can test that objectively by flashing individual letter forms on the screen and let the participant then confirm whether they have seen the right letter or not. And the greater the failure rate, the lower the legibility, or the longer it takes a participant to figure out what the letter was, the lower the legibility.
If you have anything available on that, Bruno, to read that you can share via link, I mean, I'd be fascinated to read it, and I'm sure many of our audience would, but we can perhaps pick that up later.
Yeah.
So just looking at the questions again, if anyone does want to raise their hand, I'm more than happy to unmute you. But other than that, we'll go to a question from Reith. I hope that's the right pronunciation. What are the main parameters to consider when designing typography for smaller screens? So I guess that's a question for you both, really.
Yeah, for smaller screens, it's less about the screen size than the resolution of the screen. Obviously, in the past, or even now, we still have this myth, going around that you shouldn't be using serif typefaces for screen-based user interfaces or screen-based navigation. But this is something that is a hangover from the early days of screen, when you had resolutions of 72 or 96 dpi. But nowadays, certainly in the developed world, we all have screens, mobile devices, laptops, etc., tablets that have 200, 240 plus pixels per inch, so plenty of resolution to really kind of like make sure you can display a character really well, even at the smaller sizes. Now, when you have a small screen, obviously say such as a mobile device, the challenges are much more typographic. How do you actually manage your layout? And because there is a minimum size that you have to use for your type, and that has to do again with how large it will appear on your retina, on your fovea, and there's a minimum size you have to use for that, but it's more about how do you structure your navigation and your hierarchies in your typographic layout in that very limited real estate of a small screen.
Yeah. So you have comfort. There's comfort, understanding, distinction between areas of information. If you, I mean, the guidelines that we publish on the GEL website around our typography sizes, size settings and stuff, and also on our accessibility guidelines are a really good guide for that, for like, best practice essentially. I mean, if you look at something like a user interface on something like TikTok with low contrast color and very small point sizes, it's very difficult to read for people who don't have perfect vision. And that's young people as well as old, remember. So it's a balance of the typographic design, like Bruno's saying, but also, looking at accessibility standards, following good guidance, and then reading it yourself and testing it. You'll learn very quickly if people are struggling with it.
Yeah. And I think it's important is, if you have some 22-year-old designing the stuff for you, always then show it to a 50-year-old. There's a world of difference.
Anita's asked a couple of questions on accessibility, but I also had one myself, so we'll come to Anita's in a moment. We know that the W3C recommend a 4.5:1 ratio for regular text and a 3:1 ratio for large text as a minimum. But I think, Bruno, in your presentation, is there not scope for us to consider a maximum? Because if we go to the opposite end of the spectrum, do we actually decrease accessibility by having too much contrast?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think there should be a setting for a maximum, because if you go full black type on a highly glaring screen or white screen glaring, that's just going to kill your eyesight completely. And as I say, it may well trigger strobophobic kind of like seizures as well. Because of the flickering, that you get in that glare. And I think it's just a matter of really of remembering good practice in typography, which harks back 500 years, kind of like when you did books, slightly off black to slightly off white, and you got the perfect contrast that reads well, that's easy on your eyes, easy on your brain. Yeah. You can't go wrong there.
Moved a couple of other points, so I'll try and combine them all into, or try and combine them into a kind of a single question. Anita asks if there is a database for fonts which are, I guess, more suitable for certain users with disabilities. So, for example, dyslexia or low vision. But I also wanted to talk about the colors used, because we see a lot of customization tools, and we see a lot of web accessibility plugins that tend to use, so for example, if you identify as having low vision, they will provide you with a blue and white color combination. So I guess two questions there around the actual suitability of font faces or font types for people with certain disabilities, and also these color combinations, are they actually scientifically valid in terms of making them more accessible to someone with low vision or dyslexia?
I can't really comment on the color combinations. I haven't really studied that, but certainly when it comes to fonts, well, first of all, there's a lot of people who say yes, you should be using these things like open dyslexia and dyslexia, etc., for people with dyslexia. It's snake oil. Let's get this clear once and for all. These fonts, and it's been scientifically proven in both in our quantitative study and in neuroscientific qualitative studies, that these fonts have zero impact overall on the reading performance of a dyslexic person. Zero impact. I mean, granted, there might be the odd person who has a preference for these fonts, but as a generalizing, no, it makes no difference whatsoever. It goes even further in that typefaces, the choice of typefaces, particularly for dyslexia, has very little impact on the reading performance of a dyslexic person. You know, very little, because it's not about reading, it's about sound. It's not about seeing, it's about sound. And we also have, and in order to understand that, you have to understand the neuroscience, you have to understand the brain. We don't read with our eyes, we read with our brain. And it's actually important what happens in the brain, how the brain processes shapes and sounds and linguistic functions, and how the memory works, the short-term memory, etc. All these things come together. You know, but good practice in typography, you know, that really helps, you know, with aiding anyone to read, such as, for example, not minus tracking type at text sizes. You know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a quote that I can't remember who said it. A friend of ours, Jamie Knight, reminded us a bit, but the plural of anecdote does not equal data. You know, until the people that design these so-called dyslexic friendly typefaces publish data that proves that they are working, then it's just anecdote, isn't it? And what we see in our industry is a lot of great practitioners who have great rigor, great experience, falling back on anecdote when they say this is a very dyslexic friendly font or whatever, and they don't know that. There's nothing to prove it. And what we've done with our research is to try and unearth whether it actually is, you know, and we're finding that it isn't. And that's not to say that the people that design these typefaces aren't doing it for the right reasons. They are. And they may have some great stuff. We'd love to see some data that actually proves that these things are better than others. It's so much like what Bruno says about how, you know, good typography, understanding color contrast, understanding colors, like the other part of your question is answering, all of those things combined, and the way the brain processes it, that's what makes something readable. It's not purely the shapes of a typeface.
Yeah, but also, you know, quite often you see the arguments by people who have designed these dyslexia fonts that they say, "Oh, I'm dyslexic myself, so therefore I know what the dyslexic reader needs." Yeah, well, I have a driving license, but that doesn't make me a car mechanic. You know, so it's because it's not about what I experience, is about actually what happens in people's brains, you know, that needs to be analyzed, and that needs to be kind of accounted for.
It's one of the issues we have in accessibility, in that, especially when we talk about neurodiverse conditions, is that the spectrum is so broad. Again, one person's experience or opinion doesn't necessarily correlate to a larger sample of people who have a similar condition.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Remember, accessibility can only be optimal. It can't be perfect.
Yeah.
That was a good accessibility
for that very reason.
So we'll go on to something. There is a question about another question on accessibility, about having as few font types as possible on a single page. And I think we'd all agree that is generally considered good practice. You wouldn't necessarily have more than one or maximum two different typefaces on the page.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like you could have two different typefaces, you know, if it aids hierarchy, if it aids the navigation of the screen, or of the screen or of a page, you know, where you want to use maybe a sans serif for a headline and then the serif for the body copy, or vice versa, you know, and that of course that affects the emotionality of your layouts as well. And it depends a little bit, you know, what it is you're trying to express as well. And because a serif typeface, for example, expresses something different to a sans or a script typeface, you know, like something more like formal handwriting is again different to, say, a black letter, etc. So choose your typefaces according to what you want to express and how you want your hierarchies to be, you know. But I think less is more. Yes. Definitely.
There's a question about the importance of the study of user experience in psychology, and how important that is for the development of typefaces. And I guess we've kind of got the impression that it is, and I kind of want to slightly rephrase the question in that more about the psychology of the user. So if we look at the BBC and the way they present stories, the way they present or the font you use to present both very good stories and also very bad stories is the same. So how does the understanding of human psychology feed into that?
Well, are they the same? I mean, we for news stories, you know, we probably use the serif because it conveys a more kind of learned, wise kind of potentially emotional engagement, whereas we don't use for the titles and the sans serif styles in like extra bold or anything like that for, you know, a news story about deaths on the West Bank. Now we have this variety of different type styles to express different bits of content. So I would argue that it's not all the same. Yes, it's one typeface, but it has a range of expression. But what was the second part of the question? Sorry, Chris.
It was really around how important is the study of UX and psychology in the development of typefaces and understanding human psychology?
It depends on the typeface. I mean, Bruno's probably better to answer this, but I would say that it depends on the brief, doesn't it? I mean, BBC Reith is a workhorse, isn't it? It has to speak to everybody and convey lots of information as a public service or a servant, right?
Yeah.
But Nickelodeon's typeface is just like crash kapow headline. It's much more of a display style of reading experience. So it really comes down to the brief, and the psychology attached to that will be imbued or built into that brief, and then however you test this forward from there is how you should respond to it. I suppose it's not. There's no silver bullet answer to that question.
Yeah, no. But I think if you want to sort of like, you know, kind of like categorize it, is when you design for a display and titling environment, you know, you can be freer with your expression because your primary purpose is to attract and the secondary purpose is to read. But if you go into a text environment, it's all about functionality. So the primary purpose is to read and not distract the reader from actually reading the content, you know. So personality expression really takes second fiddle, big time, you know. And you have, if you want to imbue some personality, you have to be very subtle and you have to start understanding, okay, what languages is this typeface used in? What are the character frequencies in different languages? So you can build in maybe some personality features, very subtle, so they're not too disturbing, but still maybe kind of like strong enough to be picked up without distracting.
Yeah.
Just had the question come in, and apologies if I don't read this in the way it was intended. So it's more for David. Do you use any standard for BBC Reith for kerning and tracking?
All of the details that you are on the GEL website for how we use BBC Reith, but we don't generally kern it or change the kerning. I mean, it may be that in display marketing moments you may do some of that, but for all of our reading experience stuff and our digital services, we don't mess with that. And as far as our leading is concerned, there's a setting for that, so it's not. You can't adjust it. You can't. Our designers can't mess with that stuff.
Yeah, maybe if I can also kind of like, you know, add to that the BBC Reef typeface and basically any good typeface, particularly for text environments, that has been designed by a professional who understands what they're doing. You do not need to change anything. It's been spaced and current, fit for purpose. Don't muck about with it, you know. Now, naturally, if you go into larger sizes, it starts visually being too loose. You need to track it in a little bit. But any typeface that you buy that is basically a text typeface, you don't need to do any tracking or kerning to it at all, up to about 16, 18 point. 16 point is probably around the threshold where you might want to just like tuck it in a fraction, you know, but below that, don't even think about it.
We are approaching 10 to 8, and so I think we'll probably just close with one final question from Richard, and I'll probably, again, paraphrase it slightly. Richard asks, do you think we'll ever run out of typefaces to design? And is there a point where we're no longer designing new typefaces, we're just tweaking and making slight changes to existing ones. So maybe more of a factual but also philosophical question.
Oh, I didn't. Sorry. I was my mind was just wandering off for a second.
Bruno, do you think that we'll ever run out of design of new typefaces, or do you think it's now just a process of tweaking what already exists?
Oh no. There's millions more typefaces to be designed. You know, I mean, it's just that with typefaces, it's like ice cream. You know, like most of us like vanilla, but we all like a slightly different shade of vanilla. You know, and all like, you know, we all like clothes, but you know, some people like Wranglers and other people like Levi's and stuff. So there will be as many typefaces, or there can be as many typefaces as there are humans on the planet. You know.
That's just creativity, isn't it? Creativity there will always be creativity, and thus there will always be different typefaces, different design approaches.
I mean, it's the same thing with music. You know, will there ever be an end to music? And at some point, you know, you could argue, well, it's just repeating itself.
Thank you. I think on that note, we will close the evening there. Again, I do apologise for the technical difficulties at the start, both to the attendees and to you, Bruno and David, as speakers. We will be sending out an email asking for feedback after the event. So if you could let us know what kind of problems you are having, then we can investigate it and make sure it doesn't happen again. It sounds like it's something that's happening with Eventbrite, so maybe next time we'll take Eventbrite out of the equation and perhaps invite people directly to Zoom. So yeah, please do let us know your feedback. Let us know the difficulties you are having. I'd like to thank Bruno and David again for giving two fantastic talks. I'd like to thank all the attendees for the evening, for joining us this evening. Hopefully in the next few months we can start to move back to in-person events. I suspect the next couple of events will still be remote because we need to build up our capacity again. It has been, I think, 15, 16 months since we held an in-person event. So please do bear with us, but please do sign up to our newsletter, keep checking our website, follow us on Twitter. And I think in the chat, a few of you have also expressed an interest in becoming a mentor. So we'll capture your details and we'll be in touch. Other than that, thank you all again, and I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you. Thanks, Bruno. Thanks,
Cheers.
Dave.
Bye.
Bye.